Stephen Sebastian made one mistake. One single text message to his best friend after watching his new boss defend him in a meeting. 7 words typed in a moment of admiration. "My boss is so hot when she's in control like that." But autocomplete betrayed him. The message landed on Ellie Reynolds' phone, instead his boss the most powerful woman in the building. For a black single dad who had spent years being invisible just to survive corporate America, this wasn't just embarrassing. It was career suicide. Or so he thought. Before we continue, let us know in the comments section where in the world you're tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And if this story speaks to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The alarm went off at 6 in the morning, same as every other day. Stephen Sebastian rolled out of bed before his eyes fully opened his body, running on autopilot after 2 years of single parenthood. He shuffled to the kitchen, started the coffee maker, then headed to his daughter's room. Sophie was already awake, sitting on her bed with tangled hair and sleepy eyes. At 8 years old, she had learned to wake herself up, something no child should have to master so young. "Morning, baby girl," Stephen said softly, kneeling beside her bed. "Morning, Daddy." She rubbed her eyes. "Can you do my hair today?" Stephen looked at the mess of curls and felt that familiar knot in his stomach. 2 years since Lisa passed, and he still couldn't braid hair properly. He'd watched countless YouTube tutorials practiced on dolls Sophie had outgrown, but his fingers never moved the way his wife's had. "I'll try my best," he promised, grabbing the comb from her nightstand. 20 minutes later, Sophie's hair was pulled into 2 uneven puffs. Not pretty, but functional. She didn't complain, she never did anymore. That silence hurt more than any criticism could. In the kitchen, Stephen packed her lunch, a simple sandwich and some crackers, nothing fancy. He glanced at the refrigerator door where a school notice hung reminding parents about the upcoming parent-teacher conference. He'd missed the last 2. Work always got in the way. "Daddy," Sophie appeared in the doorway, backpack already on. "When can I come to your office?" The question caught him off guard. "Why would you want to do that? I want to see where you work, where you go every day." Stephen hesitated. He'd never brought Sophie to the agency. The thought of mixing his 2 worlds made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't fully explain. At work, he was careful, calculated. He kept his head down and his opinions to himself. Bringing his daughter there felt like exposing something vulnerable. "Soon, baby. I promise." Sophie nodded, but her eyes said she'd heard that promise before. As they walked to the bus stop, Stephen noticed the drawing sticking out of her backpack. He caught a glimpse of it, 3 figures standing together. A family, but the third person had no face, just a blank oval where features should be. He pretended not to see it. The advertising agency occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in Manhattan. Stephen had worked there for 6 years, longer than most people in his department. He was good at his job, exceptional actually, but promotions had a way of passing him by. He'd learned not to question it too loudly. The elevator opened to the familiar buzz of creative chaos. Designers hunched over screens, account managers rushed between meetings, and somewhere a phone rang endlessly. Stephen walked to his desk in the corner, nodded at a few colleagues who barely looked up, and settled into his chair. Today was different. Today, the new creative director would address the team for the first time. Ellie Reynolds had been appointed 2 weeks ago, but this was her first official team meeting. Stephen had heard the whispers. First woman to hold the position in the company's history. Youngest creative director they'd ever hired. Some people admired her. Others waited for her to fail. The conference room filled quickly. Stephen took his usual seat in the back, notepad, ready, expression neutral. He'd perfected the art of being present without being noticed. Ellie entered exactly on time. She was tall, composed, wearing a blazer that probably cost more than Stephen's monthly rent. Her face revealed nothing, no warmth, no anxiety, no eagerness to please. She scanned the room, once then began. "I don't believe in long introductions," she said. "You know who I am. I know your work. Let's get to it." The meeting moved fast. Project updates, deadline adjustments, resource allocation. Stephen took notes, contributed, nothing stayed invisible. Then Brian Mitchell stood up. Brian was the kind of colleague Stephen had learned to tolerate. Confident, well-connected, always ready to take credit for work that wasn't entirely his. Today, he was presenting a concept for their biggest client's upcoming campaign. The idea centers on authenticity. Brian explained, clicking through slides that looked painfully familiar. We show real families, real struggles, real connections. It's emotional without being manipulative. Stephen felt his jaw tighten. Those slides, that concept. He'd shared it 3 weeks ago in a team email asking for feedback. Brian hadn't even changed the color scheme. Ellie studied the presentation with an unreadable expression. When Brian finished, she didn't applaud or praise. Instead, she pulled out her tablet and scrolled through something. "This concept," she said slowly, "it reminds me of something I saw recently." She looked up, scanning the room until her eyes landed on Stephen. "Mr. Sebastian, correct?" Stephen straightened in his chair. "Yes. You sent an email on the 15th. Subject line was, 'Rough concept feedback welcome.' Am I remembering correctly?" The room went silent. Brian's confident smile flickered. "Yes, that was mine." Stephen confirmed, his voice steady, despite his racing heart. Ellie nodded. "I thought so. The visual language is identical." She turned to Brian. "Mr. Mitchell, perhaps you'd like to explain how you developed this concept independently?" Brian stammered something about collaboration and shared inspiration, but Ellie was already moving on. She gestured toward Stephen. "Mr. Sebastian, since this is your concept, would you like to walk us through the thinking behind it?" For 6 years, Stephen had kept quiet. For 6 years, he'd let his work speak for itself, or more accurately, let others speak for his work. But something in Ellie's direct gaze made him stand up. He explained the concept, the emotional core, the visual storytelling techniques he'd researched. With each sentence, he felt himself becoming visible in a way he'd always avoided. When he finished, Ellie simply said, "Thank you. That's the direction we're taking. Mr. Sebastian will lead the visual development." The meeting ended shortly after. As people filed out, Stephen caught Brian's hostile glare, but didn't look away. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to shrink. Back at his desk, Stephen couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Ellie Reynolds had done something no one else had bothered to do. She'd actually read his emails. She'd paid attention. She'd given credit where it was due. He pulled out his phone to text Derek, his best friend from his previous job. "Bro, you won't believe what just happened." Derek responded immediately, "Tell me everything." Stephen typed quickly, his fingers moving faster than his judgment. "My boss is so hot when she's in control like that. I've never seen anyone handle a meeting like this." He hit send. Then he looked at the screen. The message hadn't gone to Derek. The contact at the top read, Ellie Reynolds, her name auto-filled from their work chat earlier that morning. Stephen stared at his phone as if it had transformed into a live grenade. His throat closed. His palms went slick with sweat. In one careless moment, he had destroyed everything. He was a black man in a predominantly white company, a single father with no safety net, a designer who had finally been seen only to immediately sabotage himself. The rules were different for people like him. One mistake could erase years of perfect behavior. For the rest of the day, Stephen waited for the inevitable. An email from HR, a call to Ellie's office, security escorting him out. He checked his phone obsessively, but Ellie sent nothing. The silence was almost worse. At 5:45, just as Stephen was preparing to leave, his computer chimed with a calendar notification. A meeting request from Ellie Reynolds, her office, 6 o'clock, no subject line, no context. Stephen walked to her office feeling like a man approaching his own execution. The hallway had never seemed so long. When he knocked on her door, his hand trembled slightly. "Come in." Ellie sat behind her desk phone, face down in front of her. The screen was dark, but Stephen knew what was on it. "Close the door," she said. He obeyed, then stood there waiting for the axe to fall. Ellie studied him for a long moment. "I received an interesting message today." "Ms. Reynolds, I am so sorry. It was meant for someone else. It was completely inappropriate and unprofessional." I understand if you need to involve HR, and I'll accept whatever consequences. She raised a hand, stopping him. Do you know why I'm not calling HR right now? Stephen shook his head, genuinely confused. Because that message was honest. You didn't know I would see it. You weren't trying to flatter me or manipulate me. You said what you actually thought. Ellie leaned back in her chair. In this company, honesty is the rarest thing I've encountered. Stephen didn't know how to respond. I've read your portfolio, Ellie continued. All of it. The work you've done here, the projects you've led quietly without recognition, the ideas that somehow always end up in other people's presentations. You're talented, Mr. Sebastian. More talented than you let anyone see. She stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the city below. There's a project coming up. A rebranding campaign for a non-profit organization that supports single-parent families. It's high-profile, high-stakes, and exactly the kind of work that could change a career. She turned back to face him. I want you to lead the visual development. Stephen felt the ground shift beneath him. Me, you. This is your chance to show everyone what you can actually do. Ellie's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Don't waste it. Walking out of her office, Stephen realized something had fundamentally changed. The text message that should have ended his career had somehow opened a door he never expected to find. But he also understood the stakes. If he failed this project, there would be no second chances. Not for someone like him. The project consumed Stephen in ways he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since joining the agency, he wasn't just executing someone else's vision, he was creating his own. The nonprofit campaign required visual storytelling that captured the reality of single-parent families without exploitation or pity. It demanded authenticity, and Stephen had plenty of that to offer. He worked late every night that first week sketching concepts, refining color palettes, building mood boards that told stories without words. The creative freedom was intoxicating, but it came with pressure he hadn't anticipated. Every eye in the company seemed to be watching, waiting to see if Ellie's faith in him was justified. On Thursday afternoon, his phone buzzed with a call from Sophie's school. Mr. Sebastian, this is Principal Davis. We need you to come pick up your daughter. Stephen's stomach dropped. Is she hurt? She's not injured, but there was an incident. She got into a physical altercation with another student. The words didn't make sense. Sophie had never been violent. She was quiet, gentle, the kind of child who apologized when someone else bumped into her. Stephen left work immediately, not bothering to tell anyone where he was going. When he arrived at the school, he found Sophie sitting outside the principal's office, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes red from crying. He knelt in front of her. Baby, what happened? Sophie's lower lip trembled. Tyler said I don't have a real family because I don't have a mom. He said families need moms and dads, and I only have one, so I'm not normal. The words hit Stephen like a physical blow. He pulled Sophie into his arms and held her tight, feeling her small body shake with suppressed sobs. You pushed him, he asked gently. I told him to stop, but he kept saying it. He said my mom probably left because she didn't want me. Stephen closed his eyes, swallowing the rage that threatened to surface. His wife hadn't left. She had fought for her life until the very end, desperate to stay with her family. Cancer had taken her, not choice. But how do you explain that to an 8-year-old who just wants the cruelty to stop? Listen to me, Stephen said, pulling back to look at his daughter's face. You have a real family, you have me, and what we have is enough. Do you understand? Sophie nodded, but her eyes held a question she didn't ask. Was it really enough? That night, after putting Sophie to bed, Stephen sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open. The project deadline loomed, but he couldn't focus. His daughter was hurting, and he didn't know how to fix it. Some wounds couldn't be healed with bandages or bedtime stories. He worked until 3 in the morning, fueled by coffee and guilt, finishing designs that should have taken 3 days. When his alarm went off at 6, he'd barely slept, but the work was done. The following Monday, Stephen presented his initial concepts to the project committee. Ellie was there, along with several department heads and one face. Stephen didn't recognize a silver-haired man in an expensive suit who watched the presentation with cold, assessing eyes. Richard Hayes. Stephen had heard the name in whispered conversations but never met the man in person. Senior Vice President board member, one of the old guard who had been with the company since before Stephen was born. According to office gossip, Richard had mentored Ellie early in her career, helped her climb the ladder. But something had soured between them when she got the creative director position, a role Richard had apparently promised to someone else. The presentation went well. The committee responded positively to Stephen's visual direction, praising its emotional depth and authenticity. Ellie allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction, but Richard remained silent throughout. When the room cleared, he approached Stephen with a handshake that felt more like a warning. "Impressive work, Mr. Sebastian," Richard said, his voice smooth as polished marble. Very personal, almost intimate. He glanced at Ellie, then back at Stephen. "I hope the final product lives up to the promise." There was something beneath those words, something Stephen couldn't quite identify. A threat wrapped in politeness. A blade hidden in silk. As Richard left, Ellie moved to stand beside Stephen. "Don't let him get to you," she said quietly. "Who is he to you?" Ellie's expression flickered with something complicated, old loyalty mixed with fresh betrayal. "Someone who taught me everything about this industry, and someone who's been waiting for me to fail ever since I got this job." The late nights continued, but they began to feel less like obligation and more like refuge. Stephen discovered that Ellie often stayed late too long after everyone else had gone home. They would pass each other in the hallway, exchange brief conversations about the project, share takeout containers in the conference room while reviewing mock-ups. One evening around 9 o'clock, Ellie found Stephen staring at his screen with bloodshot eyes. "When's the last time you slept properly?" she asked. Stephen rubbed his face. "Define properly." She pulled up a chair beside him, something she'd never done before. "You're going to burn out before we finish." "I don't have that luxury." He gestured vaguely toward the window toward the city beyond. "Sophie's school called last week. Some kid told her she doesn't have a real family because she doesn't have a mom. She got into a fight." Ellie was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry. It's not your fault." Stephen leaned back in his chair. "I just keep thinking I work so hard to provide for her, but maybe what she actually needs is for me to be present. Not just physically there, but actually present." "That's the impossible math of working parenthood," Ellie said. "No matter how you divide it, the numbers never add up." Stephen looked at her. "You speak like you understand." "Not from personal experience. I chose career over family a long time ago." Her voice carried no self-pity, just simple fact. "But I watched my parents make that calculation every day. Immigrants. They worked double shifts so I could have opportunities they never had. I barely saw them growing up, but everything I am exists because of what they sacrificed." It was the most personal thing she'd ever shared with him. Stephen realized that beneath her polished exterior, Ellie was fighting her own battles, constantly proving herself in a world that questioned whether she belonged. "People underestimate you," he said. "They see what they want to see." Ellie met his gaze. "They underestimate you, too. The difference is you've let them." The words stung because they were true. 2 weeks later, the project approached completion. The campaign had taken shape into something beautiful, visual narratives that honored single parents without romanticizing their struggles, images that celebrated found families in all their imperfect glory. On the day of the final review, Stephen's babysitter canceled at the last minute. Left with no choice, he brought Sophie to the office for the first time, finally keeping that long-delayed promise. Sophie walked through the agency with wide eyes, taking in the open floor plan, the colorful walls, the creative chaos that her father inhabited every day. Stephen set her up in an empty conference room with her sketchbook and colored pencils, promising to check on her every hour. The review meeting ran long. When Stephen finally emerged, he found something unexpected. Ellie sitting next to Sophie, their heads bent together over the sketchbook. He stopped in the doorway, watching. "What are you drawing?" Ellie was asking. Sophie held up the page. 3 figures standing together. A family. The third person wasn't faceless like before. This time the features were blurry but present like a photograph, not quite in focus. "That's my family," Sophie said. "That's my dad and that's me and that's—" She trailed off suddenly shy. Ellie studied the drawing with genuine interest. "Who's the third person?" "I don't know yet," Sophie admitted. "But I think maybe someone's supposed to be there. My mom used to be there, but she's in heaven now. So now there's a space." Ellie's composed expression softened in a way Stephen had never witnessed. "I understand spaces," she said quietly. "My grandmother passed away when I was about your age. For a long time, I felt like there was a hole in my family, too." "Did it ever get filled?" Ellie considered the question carefully. "Not filled exactly, but the shape of it changed. New people came into my life who didn't replace what I lost. They just added something different. Does that make sense?" Sophie nodded slowly, processing this wisdom from an unexpected source. Stephen stepped into the room, his heart doing something strange and unfamiliar in his chest. The 2 most important people in his world were sitting together, and the sight terrified him as much as it moved him. "I see you found my hiding spot," he said to Ellie, keeping his voice light. "Your daughter is an excellent artist, better than most of my design team." Sophie beamed, and Stephen felt that dangerous warmth spread deeper. The campaign launched to immediate success. Industry publications praised its authenticity. The nonprofit reported a significant spike in donations and volunteer applications. Within the company, Stephen's work was finally receiving the recognition it deserved. But success drew attention, and attention drew scrutiny. Richard Hayes had been watching, waiting, collecting information like a patient spider building a web. 3 weeks after the campaign launch, Stephen noticed a shift in the office atmosphere. Conversations stopped when he walked by. Colleagues who had congratulated him now avoided eye contact. Something was wrong, but no one would tell him what. The answer came during an emergency leadership meeting that Stephen wasn't invited to, but heard about from Derek, who had connections in every department. "Someone brought up that text message," Derek said over the phone, his voice tense. "The one you sent to Ellie by accident." Stephen's blood ran cold. That was months ago. She handled it directly. "Yeah, well now Richard Hayes is framing it differently. He's saying there's been inappropriate conduct between you and Ellie. That she gave you the project because of personal feelings, not professional merit. That she's compromised her judgment." The accusation was absurd, but Stephen understood immediately why it was dangerous. The text message, stripped of context, looked exactly like what Richard wanted it to look: evidence of impropriety. A black man making suggestive comments about his white female boss. A boss who then gave that man a career-changing opportunity. The optics were devastating. "There's a board meeting scheduled," Derek continued. "Richard is pushing for a vote of no confidence against Ellie. He wants her removed." Stephen hung up the phone, feeling like the floor had collapsed beneath him. His one careless mistake was now being weaponized to destroy the woman who had given him a chance. And in the process, it would destroy him too. That evening, Ellie called him into her office. Her face was composed, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. "I assume you've heard," she said. "I'm so sorry. This is my fault. If I hadn't sent that stupid message, then Richard would have found another angle of attack." Ellie shook her head. "This isn't about the text. It's about power and who gets to have it. I'm an inconvenient obstacle and you're convenient ammunition. What are you going to do?" "What I always do. Stand my ground and let them take their shot." But beneath her confident words, Stephen heard the weariness of someone who had been fighting uphill battles for too long. He went home that night with a weight in his chest that made breathing difficult. Sophie was already in bed when he arrived, but she wasn't asleep. He found her sitting up waiting for him. "Daddy, you look sad." Stephen sat on the edge of her bed, unable to hide his distress. "Just tired, baby." "Is it about work? About Ms. Ellie?" He looked at his daughter, surprised by her perception. "How do you know about Ellie? You talk about her sometimes. And she was nice to me." Sophie tilted her head, studying her father with eyes that saw too much. "Did she do something wrong?" "No, sweetheart. She didn't do anything wrong." "Did you do something wrong?" Stephen considered the question. "I made a mistake a while back, and now some people are using that mistake to hurt her. Why don't you tell everyone it was just a mistake?" The simplicity of the question cut through all of Stephen's complicated adult reasoning. Why didn't he? Because he was afraid. Because standing up meant making himself a target. Because people like him weren't supposed to draw attention or make waves or challenge the established order. But his daughter was looking at him, waiting for an answer. The same daughter who had pushed a boy for insulting their family. The same daughter who drew pictures of futures she couldn't quite see yet. What was he teaching her by staying silent? "Daddy," Sophie prompted. Stephen tucked the blanket around her, kissed her forehead, and made a decision that would change everything. "Sometimes," he said softly, "telling the truth is the hardest thing in the world, but maybe that's exactly why we have to do it." Stephen didn't sleep that night. After Sophie's question, he sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring at the wall where her family drawings hung. 3 figures. One with no face, then one with blurry features, each iteration moving closer to something complete. His daughter was 8 years old, and she understood something that had taken him 34 years to grasp. Truth wasn't just about honesty, it was about courage. It was about deciding what kind of person you wanted to be when no one was watching, and then being that person when everyone was. By morning, Stephen had made his choice. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Stephen arrived at the office at 8, earlier than usual. He spent 2 hours at his computer, pulling together everything he needed: email threads, project timelines, documentation that told a story Richard Hayes didn't want anyone to hear. He also made one phone call. Derek had spent years building relationships across every department in the company. He knew people in IT and accounting in the executive offices. When Stephen explained what he needed, Derek didn't hesitate. "I've been waiting for someone to finally stand up to that man," Derek said. "Give me an hour." By 9:30, Stephen had what he needed: internal communications that Derek had obtained from colleagues who had their own grievances against Richard, emails showing resource reallocations, calendar manipulations, a pattern of sabotage that stretched back months. At 9:45, he walked toward the executive conference room on the top floor. Ellie was nowhere in sight. She had been asked not to attend while the board discussed her fate. The irony was cruel. The accused denied the right to face her accusers. A security guard stood outside the conference room door. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sebastian. This meeting is board members only." "I understand," Stephen said calmly. "But they're discussing me in there. I have a right to speak." "Sir, I can't let you—" "Then call someone who can." The guard hesitated, uncertain how to handle this quiet defiance. Before he could decide, the door opened. Richard Hayes stood in the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to cold amusement. "Mr. Sebastian, what brings you here?" "I need to address the board." Richard smiled the way a cat smiles at a cornered mouse. "I don't think that's appropriate given the circumstances." "The circumstances are exactly why I need to speak." Stephen held Richard's gaze without flinching. "You're making accusations about me, about my work, about my character. The least you can do is let me respond." From inside the room, a woman's voice called out, "Let him in, Richard." Richard's smile tightened, but he stepped aside. Stephen walked into the conference room, feeling the weight of a dozen stares pressing down on him. The board members sat around a long mahogany table, mostly older, mostly white, mostly watching him with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. He recognized a few faces from company events. The woman who had spoken was Margaret Collins, the board's longest-serving member. She gestured toward an empty chair. "Have a seat, Mr. Sebastian." "I'd prefer to stand if that's all right." Stephen positioned himself where everyone could see him. His heart pounded, but his voice remained steady. "I know why you're here. You're deciding whether Ellie Reynolds is fit to lead this company's creative division, and I know that part of that decision involves me." Richard leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "We're simply reviewing some concerns about professional conduct." "No," Stephen cut him off. "You're using a text message I sent months ago to manufacture a scandal that doesn't exist." The room went still. "That message was a mistake," Stephen continued. "I meant to send it to a friend, and it went to Ellie instead. It was embarrassing and unprofessional, and I take full responsibility for it. But Ellie handled it directly and appropriately. She didn't report it to HR because she recognized it for what it was, a careless accident, not harassment or manipulation." Richard's expression hardened. "And then she gave you a major project. Quite a coincidence." "She gave me that project because I earned it." Stephen pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. "This is documentation of my work over the past 6 years, ideas I developed that ended up in other people's presentations, projects I contributed to without credit, email threads showing exactly who created what and when." He opened the folder, spreading pages across the table. "Ellie Reynolds is the first person in this company who actually looked at my work and saw what I could do. She gave me an opportunity based on merit, the same merit that should have been recognized years ago." Margaret picked up one of the pages, scanning it with growing interest. Other board members leaned forward. Stephen wasn't finished. "But I didn't come here just to defend myself. I came because someone in this room has been working against Ellie since the day she was appointed." He turned to face Richard directly. "You mentored her. You helped her career. And when she got the job you wanted to give to someone else, you decided she needed to fail." Richard's composure cracked for the first time. "That's a serious accusation." "It's the truth." Stephen pulled out another set of documents. "These are internal communications showing how resources were redirected away from Ellie's projects. Meeting schedules changed at the last minute to exclude her. Client relationships quietly undermined. I obtained these from colleagues who have witnessed this pattern firsthand, people who were afraid to speak up until now." The room erupted in murmurs. Board members exchanged glances, some shocked, others calculating. Richard stood up, his face flushed with anger. "You have no right to access those communications. This is a violation of what?" Stephen asked. "Company policy, professional standards." He shook his head. "You talk about standards, but what are yours? Using a man's honest mistake to destroy a woman who earned her position, hiding behind procedure while you play politics with people's careers." Margaret held up a hand, silencing the growing chaos. "Mr. Sebastian, these are serious allegations. Can you verify the authenticity of these documents? Every email is time-stamped and traceable. IT can confirm the metadata, and I'm not the only one who's seen this pattern. There are others willing to corroborate if the board chooses to investigate." Stephen straightened his shoulders. "I know I might lose my job for this. I know standing here makes me a target. But my daughter asked me a question last night that I couldn't answer. She asked why I don't just tell everyone the truth." His voice softened but didn't waver. "I've spent my whole career being invisible because I thought that was the only way to survive. I told myself that keeping quiet was smart, that not making waves was professional. But silence isn't professionalism, it's fear, and I don't want my daughter growing up watching her father be afraid." The room was completely silent now. "Ellie Reynolds didn't do anything wrong," Stephen concluded. "She saw potential in someone the rest of you overlooked, and she gave that person a chance. If that's a crime in this company, then maybe the problem isn't with her leadership." He stepped back from the table. "That's all I have to say." The aftermath unfolded over several weeks. An internal investigation was launched into Richard Hayes' conduct. The evidence Stephen provided, combined with corroborating testimony from other employees and additional documentation that surfaced during the inquiry, painted a damning picture of systematic sabotage. Richard resigned before the investigation concluded, accepting a quiet exit to avoid public embarrassment. Ellie kept her position. More than that, she used the moment to push for changes in how the company handled internal complaints, credit attribution, and promotion processes. Some board members resisted, but Margaret championed the reforms, and slowly things began to shift. Stephen didn't receive an immediate promotion. This wasn't a fairy tale where courage was instantly rewarded with corner offices and raises. But something more valuable changed. People started seeing him. His ideas were heard in meetings. His contributions were credited properly. The invisibility he had cultivated for years began to dissolve. He and Ellie had a long conversation about what came next for them personally. They agreed to disclose their relationship to HR, formally following every protocol, leaving no room for future accusations of impropriety. It wasn't romantic or dramatic, it was honest, which felt more meaningful than any grand gesture. 3 months later, on a Saturday afternoon, Stephen finally kept the promise he had made to Sophie so many times before. He brought her to the office not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The building was quiet on weekends, but Ellie was there catching up on work. She met them in the lobby dressed casually in a way Stephen had never seen at the office before. Sophie ran to her, immediately wrapping her arms around Ellie's waist. The ease of it still surprised Stephen how naturally his daughter had accepted this new person in their lives, how the space in her drawings had begun to fill. "I brought something to show you," Sophie announced, pulling a folded paper from her backpack. She opened it, carefully revealing her latest drawing. 3 figures standing together. This time all 3 faces were clear, distinct, complete. "That's our family," Sophie said simply. Ellie knelt down to look at the drawing, her composed exterior giving way to something raw and unguarded. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Stephen watched them, his heart full in a way he had forgotten was possible. The grief of losing Lisa would never fully disappear, but it had transformed into something he could carry rather than something that crushed him. His phone buzzed. A text from Derek. "Bro, you've been quiet. Update me. How's everything?" Stephen smiled, looking at Ellie and Sophie still examining the drawing together, their heads bent close. He typed his response. "My boss is still so hot, and this time she knows it." He hit send. This time it went to the right person.